Hi everyone, welcome back to another tutorial video. This video is going to provide a quick overview about using outside sources from a rhetorical analysis perspective. Now this video is going to serve two purposes. Number one, you will have information on the reasons why you would choose the different types of outside source material and the 4 different ways you might actually use the sources and how you would integrate them into your writing. The other way is for essay 2, in that you can use the same principles to analyze another person's argument to determine how they're using their information and to determine whether or not that information is being used effectively. In other words, for essay number 2, you are to analyze whether or not the argument is strong or weak, depending on the type of information they're using, how they're using it, and whether or not it logically supports the information and claims that they're trying to make in their writing. So for the purpose of this particular video, I'm going to focus on how it will be useful for essay number 2, but do keep in mind that you can use this information and should use this information when you are developing your own argumentative essays. So first, this is called the B model, which stands for background, exhibits, argument, and method. In some sense, we want to look at, again, the rhetorical situation. If you are unfamiliar about what I mean by the rhetorical situation, be sure to watch the video from earlier on in the semester that gives a breakdown about what that entails. But for the most part, we know that we have to, when we make an argument, go and gather outside sources, or what we call source material, and borrow them in order to integrate them into our writing for one purpose or another. In many instances, when students are writing, they often don't think about how they're using the information and why they're using the information. The focus is more of, I have it, I'm going to put it in because it's required, and that's about it. This leads to errors in logic. This leads to weak arguments. And so I want to touch upon a few points here and then just give you a brief overview of what some of these elements look like in action, or in some sense, what they might look like in a paragraph. So first, when we are looking at outside sources, we often use outside sources for background information. And when we are writing an essay, more often than not, background information can find its way towards the beginning of the essay, because you want to, number one, demonstrate to your reader that you have a firm understanding of the background of the topic or issue in which you are addressing. Now, remember that background information is not always necessary in your writing. It just depends on, again, your purpose and rhetorical situation. But in the instance that you need to give facts or context for your writing, and more importantly, especially in argumentative writing, to demonstrate that you have credibility, this would be considered ethos, that you have accurate background information. And it also points to where you're getting that information from. Remember that despite the fact that we have background info almost anywhere, books and articles and all kinds of texts, you are ultimately making a decision about where you're getting your background information. And this speaks to the reader, of course, to determine whether or not that credibility is strong. So in the instance of analyzing, let's say for essay number 2 in particular, you want to determine whether or not the author has credibility. And so you'll want to evaluate the information that they get to produce their background info. Where are they getting their facts, and are they giving a sufficient context using this background information? So remember that the background information is not necessarily used to prove a point per se, or necessarily to support using evidence. It's not about that. Really, the background information is just that, in order to provide background information, to give context, provide facts, or present an authoritative information. Next, we have exhibits. So exhibits, and most people know this for the concept of evidence, but exhibits is not just evidence itself. And so when we're taking information, we're moving beyond the background, and we are taking information specifically to do one of multiple functions. So that is to be analyzed, to be interpreted, and or to be used as evidence or proof or support of something. Okay. Now, as I said, as a writer, if you're writing an argumentative paper, you're going to have to do these types of moves in your writing at some point. To the extent of how much of it you need, again, goes back to your purpose and your rhetorical situation. And of course, the kinds of claims that you're making in your writing. If you are analyzing, let's say for essay number 2, you want to analyze the author's arguments. Now, if they're taking outside information, are they using it to analyze it, right? And so if they are, you need to draw the conclusions about whether or not their analysis is logical, whether their analysis of that outside source is even credible, if their analysis of that is, as I said, if it actually makes sense and is reasonable. If it's not, and you're comparing what they say to what the information that they're incorporating, then that becomes a weakness in their argument. The same thing with interpretation. Now, you and I can both read the same piece of information, right? And so they can interpret it one way and I can interpret it another way. But in the grand scheme of things, you want to see what they're trying to do with that interpretation. What's the point of it? What's the purpose, right? The other thing too is you want to verify. So they could potentially be taking something out of its context, right? So let's say they incorporate a quotation or a paraphrase of something and they want to interpret it themselves. They can. A prime example of this is the Constitution. So with exhibits, more often than not, exhibits are primary sources, and primary sources are usually first-hand accounts, documents, text, images, artistic works, things like that exist on their own. And then our job for that is to analyze it, interpret it for our own purposes. So if we're using the Constitution, for example, a lot of people always try to cite or provide the exhibit of the Constitution, and they provide their own interpretation. And so your job is to analyze the effectiveness of their interpretation. Do you think that it's logical? Do you think it's reasonable? Now, if they're using this outside source for interpretation and you've deemed it unreasonable or illogical, you'll have to explain why that's the case and support your position. Now, with evidence, of course, that's more about proof. So this can look like a number of different things. It could be numbers, it could be statistics, information, things of that nature. So as we look at evidence a little bit more closely, I want to jump here ahead into this document. And so one of the things that you can see, of course, with the evidence is that they can be numbers, statistics, names of people, an expert opinion, specialized knowledge, individual stories, examples, physical details, dialogue, things that are, again, primary sourced information. And then all of this, as we know, they are what they are on their own, but when we give them context or when we include them in our writing, we often have to interpret what they mean, and then we also have to make connections to what we're saying about them, right? Or why we're using it, and what are we using it as evidence for, right? And so as you analyze essay number 2, naturally, you'll want to think about that. How are they trying to incorporate the evidence? Is it logical? Is it a logical fallacy? So you'll want to review the other videos about correlation and causation to see that they're not drawing conclusions that show something that it really doesn't, right? You'll want to look for, as I indicated before, logical fallacies. You'll want to see whether or not the information is being manipulated in order to fit their agenda. So these are things that you're going to have to analyze for yourself. The other type that we use it for is argument. Now, this is going to be for secondary sources usually, and secondary sources are just that. It's a people's interpretation of something. So this might be things like scholarly articles, opinion pieces in a magazine or a newspaper. So meaning that it's their interpretation of the primary source and you're using it. You're basically using their analysis or interpretation for your own purposes. And so argument is a little tricky, right? And so you're going to get a lot of this as well, especially when you're analyzing essay number 2. Of course, you'll use it yourself when you write an argumentative paper on your own. But when you're analyzing, you're going to want to see how they're using, again, the information. So Are they trying to use it just to show a conversation or the discourse that's happening, meaning to present both sides of an issue? That's often a popular one. They can also use it to refute information, meaning the author maybe is incorporating information to challenge that. That could also be to refine, to extend or build upon, or affirm, meaning to agree with the information or what those people are talking about. So you have to be cautious with this, as I said before, because it's almost like you really have to do double the work when you see these types of information find their way. This is like, for instance, in a newspaper article, you might see them refer to, a study was put out and, some scientists did this. Well, you're trusting their word that their interpretation of that information is accurate. So what I always tell students is that you may want to go find that study, or you may want to go find that poll, because there are often times where authors will mislead information. This again goes back to credibility. Are they interpreting the information themselves? Did they understand the study? Are they manipulating the information just so they can say, oh, there's a study there, but the study could actually be in opposition to their point? So depending on what they're using, you're going to have to evaluate it almost on two levels, right? To determine whether or not that information that they're presenting for their argument actually works for their argument. Or the other layer is to determine that there is credibility there. Remember, I can't stress this enough, but when you're on this level of using information and relying on someone else's interpretation, or they are, incorporating their own interpretation of something else, you have different layers. So it's like sometimes messages get lost along the way, or information gets, translated differently. So it's like playing the game of telephone. If multiple people are looking and talking about some information, and by the time it gets to you, and by the time they present it to you as the reader, you'll want to know if that information is accurate. Okay. And then, so finally, the other is methods. This usually focuses on terminology, concepts, basically interpretation of exhibits. So one thing I do want to mention for your analysis for essay number 2 is terminology and concepts. Every time that there is an article that talks about things like, let's say for the instance of example, feminism, or, toxic masculinity, those are all technical terms, and they all have different interpretations and definitions depending on who you ask. And so you're going to want to, in your own writing, when you're providing terms like this argument, you always want to kind of give a sense of what definition we're using, or how you understand it. And the same thing when you're analyzing, right? So you all are going to be analyzing an argument from an author, and they might be using specific terms, but they're not necessarily defining them. And if they don't explicitly come right out and say, here's the definition of this, you have to find ways in which it reflects how they see it. So in other words, you'll want to consider how it's being used in the context. So as a brief example, this article is entitled, Has Feminism Killed the Art of Home Cooking? And throughout this article, she doesn't define feminism or give us a straight definition of how she understands what feminism is. However, she does to a certain extent without realizing it, or maybe she does. So here in this passage where it says, it's important to remember that women can embrace cookery without betraying their cause. Being a feminist does not mean dropping femininity. So in this instance, she's giving us her understanding of feminism, that what feminism is about is this idea of not being a feminine person, or dropping the idea of femininity. And of course, many know that feminism isn't really about that. It's more about equity than anything else. And so if you find this could be something that you can critique, of course. Now, what she could have done is actually bring in a quote, or give us, some information about the term and whose term she's using it, and if she could still find a way to make it support her point. But in this instance, she does not do that, and this is sort of her way of trying to demonstrate how she understands feminism. So with that being said, with this document, you're going to want to go ahead and go through and look at the different examples of ways in which the information is being used. So for background, we have giving context. In this example, we see, furthermore, students not only perceive teacher comments as vague, but often contradictory in the several ways in which teachers respond. In these instances, it is significant for teachers to provide students instruction in interpreting instructor feedback. And then so we get the sense of what the conversation or the context is for this purpose, and then we have our discussion about it and what's the point. Next is facts here. As you can see, in 2019, David Huck and Sarah Park Dallin produced an updated infographic illustrating the disparities in children's literature based on race, which shows that 50% of the books published for children feature primarily white characters, while only 1% feature First Nations Indigenous, 5% Latinx, 7% Asian Pacific Islander, and 10% African American. After white characters, the next largest group represented in children's literature is animals other, with 27%. More than characters in all of non-white racial groups combined, this graphic highlights the gap. So in this instance, we're not really arguing anything. As I said, the background information is only there to provide facts and saying, hey, this is what it is. And of course, you want to give the purpose of providing the facts, right? It's not necessarily argumentative in nature or anything, or to use as evidence or proof in this example. However, that doesn't mean that this fact can't be used for argumentative purpose later, but in the instance of the way this is written here, it's used solely for factual information. Okay. With that being said, same thing with authoritative information. If you're providing background information so that way you can demonstrate your credibility, that's one way to do it as well. So with all the information here, we have the citation. This is an APA format. So we cite an expert in the field about the concept of what's called windows and mirrors. And in this instance, after we cite it, we say is a foundation when advocating for diversifying literature selections in classrooms. So again, not necessarily arguing anything, but simply providing the credibility and background information and context for the purpose of this paper, whatever that might be. As you move on to exhibits, of course, the same thing here. You are using something to be interpreted. I included one for primary sources, and then evidence, of course. So in this example, you're going to see how those are used. So you can read through that and kind of analyzed in that way. So again, with the exhibits, they are often primary sources, as I said before, and so they're not really filtered through anywhere, no one else, it's just information that's being presented, and then you're analyzing or interpreting however you might need to. Okay. Finally, you have argument, and so this is kind of where you're going to understand and possibly critique. Again, a majority of your critique for essay number 2 is how they're using this information for the most part. Okay. So go ahead and go through all of this. This document is going to be uploaded as well, so you can take some time to review it. But if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and keep this document in handy. It's going to be helpful for academic writing in helping you not only to develop your own arguments, but also to analyze other authors' arguments as well.